finally, a source of raw, real, and honest information on healthcare issues that matter most. Welcome to BS Free MD. From the latest medical information to how to stay sane as a doctor or a patient, no subject is taboo, no BS is allowed. Now, let's welcome your hosts, Doctors May and Tim Hindmarsh.
Well, this week, you guys are in for an absolute treat. This is an amazing, amazing episode with Dr. Peter McCullough, who needs really no introduction. He is one of the most published cardiologists in the world. He's probably published more articles than anyone in the world on COVID, especially early treatment. He's been on every single show. He got, I think it was 40 million downloads on Joe Rogan in like a week or 2 weeks or something. It's just crazy, and he has been so gracious to give us an hour of his time. But before we get to the imminent Dr. McCullough, we have a word from our sponsor, May.
Yeah, this week we are featuring New Leaf Hyperbarics and Wellness. They are our sponsor, and we love them so much because we personally need their services. And it's been a while since Tim and I have been in the hyperbaric chamber. But believe me, you want to get in there for all your ailments, especially orthopedic aches and pains. I'm a firm believer, but wound healing as well as healing from all kinds of ailments. You can check out their website at newleafeugene.com. That's newleafeugene.com, as well as take a peek at what they've got to offer in terms of therapies, including massage and the infrared bed, which is really going to help out. So check them out.
All right. Welcome back to BS Free MD. We are super excited to have Dr. Peter McCullough back with us. We talked to him last back, I think it was in May of 2021, and a whole lot has changed since then. So Dr. McCullough, somebody who needs almost no introduction, welcome back.
Well, thanks for having me back on. It seems like eons ago we were on, and so much has happened since that time. I think tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of papers have been published on the pandemic.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, wow, it's been a while. And then we were so grateful to have you on. I mean, that was kind of near the beginning. Then you went on Joe Rogan, and that blew up. And we thought, no fair, you were on our show first. But anyway, a lot has gone on, both with what you're doing, what we've been doing in the pandemic. And wow, so much to get to. So tell us and our audience, first off, we're super excited to hear about your book coming out. Tell us how did you get hooked up with author John Leake, the true crime writer, on this, and how did the book come
John
about?
Leake initiated it. He's a true crime author from Dallas, Texas. He went to college at Boston University. Then he went off and lived most of his life in Europe, in Vienna. And as COVID-19 was sweeping across Europe, Vienna was closing down, he decided to come back to Dallas, and he sensed that a crime was going on, a giant crime was going on. He looked for somebody who was developing expertise in the illness and someone, willing to challenge the orthodoxy. That was me. And so we teamed up. It took a year to write the book. The title of the book is Courage to Face COVID-19, Preventing Hospitalizations and Deaths While Battling the Biopharmaceutical Complex. It's number one in viral diseases, communicable diseases, and true crime on Amazon. It's been out for about 3 months now. It's over 300 pages, about 300 references, and it's a nonfiction narrative. So it's not a medical book. It's a story. And what we've learned is this is such a complex reality. It is so far beyond people's imagination this could actually be happening that we actually have to tell it in the format of a story, a fun to read story. The chapters are short, the print is big, and it relates to certain events in history. And it's a fun read. I'm a character in the book, but also so is Vladimir Zelenko, the late Dr. Zelenko, Dr. Didier Rialt, Ron Johnson, Joe Rogan, Tucker Carlson. They're all characters in the book. How did this actually all happen? And in the end, it presents to the readership that, in fact, a crime has been committed. Two crimes. One is fraud, and the second one is mass negligent homicide. And this is through the mechanism of suppressing early treatment of COVID-19. Who are the victims? About 1 million Americans who lost their lives and about 10 million who are unnecessarily hospitalized. Who are the perpetrators? The perpetrators are what we call the Biopharmaceutical Complex, basically a syndicate that's working now worldwide. And the syndicate has got a variety of powerful members, including the World Economic Forum, the Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, the Rockefeller Foundation, CEPI, Center for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, World Health Organization, Chinese Communist Party, Eco Health Alliance, Gavi, and then the suppliers are these vaccine manufacturers. But the biopharmaceutical complex, they're the perpetrators, and they're actively suppressing treatment. They're actively creating a false narrative to force mass vaccination on the world.
Yeah, it never ceases to blow my mind. The mass vaccination part is kind of where everything sort of falls apart for me. I mean, I literally ran into another physician at an airport a little while ago, and I said to her, I said, look, the vaccine doesn't do anything now. It's probably, has negative results at this stage of the game. It may have had some signals of benefit early for hospitalization and death. It never stopped transmission, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And she goes, yeah, well, I'm an obstetrician, and every patient we had that wasn't vaccinated were the ones that got really sick. And I said, okay, that might have been true for 3 months. It's not true now. And I said, but here's the thing that I don't understand. Why no early treatment? Monoclonal antibodies were made by big pharma companies. We in our little dinky, town we live in of 11,000, we treated about 1,000 patients with monoclonal antibodies. It was a raging success. I said, why only one thing? If you're fighting a war, you fight it on all fronts that you need to fight it. You use your Navy, you use your Air Force, you use your Army. And here it was just the vaccine. So I posed it that way. I was very gracious to her. And she goes, I don't know. And she opens a magazine and starts reading. And I'm like, you're kidding.
Yeah, that's an important vignette, because, this idea of there was a false claim on hospitalization and death. We know that because there never was a randomized trial with hospitalization and death that showed any signal for a benefit of the vaccines, even very early on. And, initially, and they still do today, the electronic medical records, like this OB-GYN, she was looking at the electronic medical record. You know what the default is? The default is unvaccinated. So when someone's hospitalized, unless that patient really, really presses their case and tries to show their vaccine card and do all this stuff, they're counted as unvaccinated. So most of these hospital administrators were doing fraudulent reports and emailing everybody saying, listen, 90% of people in the hospital are unvaccinated. That was just because Epic, the default is unvaccinated. In fact, these people were vaccinated. We know this in papers published early in 2021 by Havers and Fillmore from the CDC and VA, that it never was true. What this person told you, that her unvaccinated patients are the ones that got sick, was never true. It was actually fraudulent, never supported by randomized trials, never supported by the published data, never any adjudication why people are there in the hospital. And we know there's only two things that reduce hospitalization and death. One is natural immunity, and the other is early treatment. And none of these analyses keep track of this. CDC has some fraudulent data out this week trying to make the claim that the vaccines reduce mortality. Again, they don't keep track of who's already had COVID and who's had early treatment. I can tell you in my practice, the first patient to call and get early treatment is the fully vaccinated patient, because they're concerned and afraid of COVID. They're the ones getting early treatment. We saw this with President Biden and Fauci and all these other public figures. So I can tell you it's a total fraud that the vaccines ever reduce hospitalization and death. We know that because in Canada, Israel, the UK, South America, South Africa, in Australia, the vast majority of those sadly dying and hospitalized are fully vaccinated.
Well, and there was another big confounder in there, which I am convinced is true, at least anecdotally from what I've seen in my own practice, which is that group of people that got the first shot and then they got COVID before the second shot. I mean, one of my motorcycle riding buddies almost died. Another friend of ours that is, lives in the South. I mean, she got a mild symptoms 2 weeks after and then got long COVID so bad that she was desaturating for over 6 months, just going to the bathroom. And this is like an athlete. And those people were put in the unvaccinated pile, and the vaccine was clearly making them more ill. Like there's no question.
That was
I think what you said,
that was seen in the regulatory dossiers of the mRNA vaccines that after shot one, there's increased risk, probably due to a misdirection of the immune system. That was published by Liu and colleagues. But there are really no data to support the vaccines on efficacy whatsoever. And what exists right now is basically fraudulent, and we see it through the medical literature. And I think the reason why doctors have not called this out, 96% of doctors with no critical thinking took these vaccines. 96%. And you ask them, why'd you do this? It's foreign genetic code. Why did you take a gene shot with no assurances on long-term safety? None. And there's really strong regulatory language that they cause blood clots, heart damage, immune system damage, neurologic damage. Like, why did you take these shots? And these doctors, I guarantee the doctor you talked to took one of the shots, and they can't explain it to you. They've lost their minds.
Or, I mean, because, hey, we confess, and we have the first two, Pfizer, that we got right away, and we thought, oh, well, they've done the studies on it. We bought into the whole, they've done some studies. They're saying that it looks good and safe. And then it wasn't until we really dug deeper, got educated, and found out how many people were in the study. And then it was like, oh my gosh, was this a wise choice or not? We kind of lumped ourselves into the older category. I've got some autoimmune things, used that as a reasoning. But after things started to come forward, even because we got those in January, and then as time went on, and by the time we were having conversations with you, and even in March, April, May, it was like, okay, this is not looking good. And we think we got saline anyway, because we had really nothing happen. And after talking with Sasha Latapova, and we had her on our podcast, when she unpacked all that for us, which was really frightening, I think, and I hope we did just get saline or a bad batch that, it wasn't truly saline, but it was
right. You got a batch
mRNA.
Invariably,
but you're right.
A batch of degraded messenger RNA that wasn't super cooled and sat out in multi-use vials. And this was revealed now in the Moderna EMA data, where easily half of the messenger RNA goes bad, and it doesn't take too much more before you have an inert shot. And we know this because, as Latipova has shown us, the complications are related to specific lots, and the lots are probably a proxy for good manufacturing, good handling, and good administration. So it's actually, if the shots do what they're supposed to, they potentially lethal or cause a blood clot. A recent Zogby survey, representative sample, 2/3 of people took the shots. They were duped into it. Turns out of those 2/3, 15% have some new disease or problem that they didn't want and they regret it. So hopefully you're in the 85% who got a dud. But it's clearly the vaccines. If it was equally distributed across all the lots, you'd say, well, it's a susceptibility problem. It's a human problem. But in fact, Senator Johnson recently at the Crony Capital meeting in Washington, myself, Malone, and Corey were there. He said, listen, he's a manufacturing executive. Senator Johnson said, we've obviously got a product problem since it's related to the lots.
Yeah. I mean, it's insane.
And interestingly, it's not like this hasn't happened before. I mean, with the first polio vaccine, when it was released, there was that company, I forget its name, in Berkeley, California, and they didn't have, the quality controls in place. And they ended up giving a bunch of kids polio and killing a bunch of people. And then they had to pull that vaccine and switch over to the second version. And I mean, Why? It was rushed out. It was exactly the same thing. They wanted polio treated with this vaccine. They wanted the vaccine out for FDR's birthday because he had polio. I mean, it was all the same political machinery. At that point, though, the head of the CDC, head of the NIH, all these people had to resign. And, I don't know, maybe that's going to happen now with Fauci all of a sudden saying that he's going to quit, which, like 3 months ago, he said he has no desire to leave until the end of essentially Biden's first term. So what do you think?
I was astonished. I looked at Fauci's departure notice on the NIH website. No mention of COVID-19. No mention of the last 3 years of his life, his signature project, no declaration of victory, as if it didn't even happen. I told Sebastian Gorka that on TV. He nearly fell out of his chair. Isn't that a stunning revelation? And here's someone.
It's like the biggest event in the last 100 years.
And no mention. And here's someone, lesson learned.
Or
he's a division chief at the National Institutes of Health, a division director. And it's not a big division. The National Cancer Institute and the National Heart and Lung Blood Institute is way bigger than his division. Never let someone in a small administrative role take on that much authority for the nation. It was a total disaster. We needed clinicians in Washington, teams of people working, monthly reviews, people, competent people citing the data. There was no competence. In Scott Atlas's book, Cloud Over Washington, he points out the role of incompetence. Fauci, Deborah Birx, the Surgeon General, that they're grossly incompetent. They simply weren't reading the papers and staying up on what was going on.
So that segues beautifully into my next question, which is, and again, it's hard to ascribe motives because, obviously that's a next level. It's not just reading papers and looking at science, but, that was Scott. I remember watching Scott Atlas on Tucker Carlson in his long format interview. And he said, look, these guys just didn't read any of the science. They didn't care. They were entirely incompetent. But is it incompetence, or was it they had an agenda and they're just going to ram their agenda through? So obviously, don't bother me with the facts because I already have my
I think it's the latter. Yeah, I think it's the latter. The vaccines were all developed way ahead of time. United States had a program on SARS through BARDA and the NIH and DARPA through the military. And the vaccines were developed far in advance of SARS-CoV-2. So the threat was being worked on by the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Harvard, a Swiss institute. The work was done in the Wuhan, China lab. But this was all done way ahead of time. This is chronicled in not only our book, but also by Peter Breggin, COVID-19 and the Global Predators, over 1,100 citations. And everybody can see this. The lab was built by bioMérieux, led by Stéphane Bainzel. And he leaves bioMérieux in 2011 and joins Moderna. And so the guy who built the Chinese lab then writes the patent with the U.S. government for the Moderna vaccine. And then within a few days of the crisis occurring, Moderna announces that they have a vaccine. So that's obviously not Operation Warp Speed. It wasn't developed. It was already there. So the vaccine is all ready to go. And with the vaccine ready to go, it was clear our leaders basically said, listen, let's go with the vaccine. Let's not even bother with treatment. Let's not even do any research on treatment. In fact, let's not even let treatment get in the way. Let's just go with the vaccine. And they had their talking points. And as Scott Atlas chronicles, they just stuck to them.
So I think of going forward, and I was driving around the other day and I kind of had a thought. Okay, all of these vaccines are still EUA. I mean, other than Comirnaty or however you pronounce that's really not being used. And I think there's obvious reasons why it's not being used because of the liability protections you get under EUA. The tests are EUA. People forget that. These PCR tests were all EUA tests. So what happens if we get a new administration or we get a congressional investigation and they just say the emergency is over? do all these EUA drugs just go away, or do they get grandfathered in? Because, the person on the street, the average person on the street, doesn't see an emergency anymore. I mean, they're watching college football. There's 75,000 people in the stadiums. No one's wearing masks. Everyone's just living their life. So, like, we have this kind of perpetual emergency. Maybe what we should be doing politically is saying, look, emergency's over. All the EUA stuff just goes away. Done.
In 1976, we passed actually a National Emergencies Act. And the whole reason to pass the act in the United States was to actually close emergencies. And at the time, there were several dozen emergencies. A lot of them just have to do with sanctions. There's been relatively few health emergencies. But in my view, since January of 2021, that's when the hospitalizations crested. We have not had an emergency since January of 2021. And to this day, we're still under the false declaration of a SARS-CoV-2 emergency. And actually, believe it or not, we're also under a false monkeypox emergency. Now, do you see any monkeypox emergency out there? You're right, football stadiums are filled, restaurants are busy. There are no health emergencies. They should be closed. Any products that are used should win full FDA approval. Now, it turns out the antibodies and some of the PCR tests and antigen tests do have full FDA clearance, so they can just be used. That's fine. But none of the vaccines have full FDA approvals because the companies have not fulfilled the biological licensing agreements. They were supposed to do studies on myocarditis, write package inserts, disclose the ingredients in the vaccines, have special safety label for pregnancy, and then they could be approved, and then they'd have to be purchased. So you'd have to buy one, or your insurance company would have to buy one. None of those things have happened. You just walk into CVS and Walgreens, and it's a free government EUA vaccine. They are not FDA approved.
I'm just thinking, how we said how everything's open. People are back to most people, I'd say 5%, still walking around airports, work, the outdoors while hiking. I mean, we see it with masks in their car by themselves, which is sad to me. I really feel for those people and the fear that they live with, sadly. But everyone else, is kind of going about their day. They've had COVID 1 or 2 times, like most of us have had COVID a couple of times and are doing okay. And if they haven't had a big health risk, they're back to normal. And so the next thing is now this next booster vaccine that they're calling it is, they're trying to roll that out, which we talked about on our show a couple of weeks ago, and pick that apart as we laughed at the 8 mice studies that they did it on, and that's their lab study to bring forth to the public. I mean, what's your thought? We think that people are just mostly going to blow this off, and there's going to be less than, I don't know, we're guessing 5% of people that really have any interest in getting any of these boosters. What's your thought on that? I
recently reviewed the current vaccine uptake data at the Gateway to Freedom conference in St. Louis. Vaccinations right now are the lowest they've ever been. No one's going in for these shots. Nobody. And the product is sitting on the shelf.
Yeah.
The CDC and FDA have said the old boosters are being retired. So you won't even be able to get an old booster, which is basically the same shot as the original shot. The new boosters are interesting. Moderna is going to go with a half-dose booster for the first time. It's 50 micrograms, and half of that is the original obsolete genetic code, which won't do anything. And then half of it's the code for the common parts of the spike protein for the BA3 and BA4 and BA5 subvariants. Pfizer is going to go with a full strength booster, 30 micrograms. And again, it's half. What I'm going to predict on safety is I'm going to predict these are going to be safer than the other shots because A, for Moderna, it's just less quantity. And then B, it's less of the really dangerous original Wuhan spike protein. And at least half of it is going to be the much more innocuous Omicron spike protein. So I predict they'll be less dangerous. But as you pointed out, with just animal data from 8 mice, the antibody responses are completely unreliable. So we have no assurances at all this is going to do anything in human beings. And so the only thing that would make somebody take one is if they're forced into taking it. Now, Justin Trudeau was just on TV basically telling Canadians they have to take it, otherwise he's putting all the restrictions back on. So we'll have to see. But, getting genetic shots every 6 months in a never-ending booster program, nobody wants this. I don't know a single person who wants this.
No, I don't think anybody can make heads or tails. I mean, people even balk at getting the flu shot every year that's been around forever. And if they're having to get boosters every 3 to 6 months, I mean, there's just no way. But sadly, I mean, I know you have family in Canada. We just came from there. My dad is relocated and is living in a independent/assisted living place. And it's sad. They just tell these people to line up because they're getting their booster. It's not forced that they're going to be evicted, but they're elderly. A lot of them just follow what the authorities say, and they all just line up and take it. And there's still the lockdowns, and it's really sad. And so there's countries like Canada and elsewhere that will be doing this. And I guess time will tell, right? And we'll see if any untoward sort of effects start to happen, especially in people with higher risks and elderly. But let's hope not.
The thing I don't understand is the total irrationality. So we go to visit him, and they have a COVID outbreak, and they've all had 4 shots by now, right? And they close the facility. No one can come in. And I'm like, well, why would you want to hold all the COVID in the facility? Maybe you should be telling them they should be staying at someone else's house who's safe. Like, it just, like, none of this makes any sense. And it's like what Geert Vanden Bossche said last week. Why is a bivalent vaccine for Omicron going to work to prevent transmission when Omicron didn't work to prevent transmission? I mean, and basically everybody got Omicron, so they got a free vaccine naturally, and it didn't work. So we're just going to give you more of the same thing. I just can't make any rational heads.
No, I agree. It's in my book. My dad was one of the first people in Dallas to get COVID in a nursing home. He got the McCullough protocol and got through it. But he's declining the vaccine. As far as we know, he hasn't had it in the assisted living part of the senior home that he's in. But he wouldn't know it if he got one. He wouldn't be able to tell us that. But I can tell you, he's been the victim of lockdown after lockdown. He's confused. He doesn't know why he has to wear a mask, why he can't see his family, because of these waves of positive tests. People aren't going to hospital anymore because Omicron's so mild. My mom, who lives in the same facility, she's on the independent living side. She did not take one of the vaccines. When she went to college, 1950s, they were rolling out some type of new influenza vaccine. They lined up the kids and they gave shots, and my mom had some type of allergic reaction, and she was in a coma for about 9 days. She lost 9 days of her life. And she said, listen, I'm not going to take any vaccine like this. It's just too risky. So she resisted. Can you imagine the fortitude it takes to be in a facility like this and say you're not going to take it? And anyhow, she ends up getting COVID. And my wife shuttles over the McCullough protocol, and she gets through it in, 5 days. She's like, I'm better. That's good. And so, all we need is early treatment for our seniors at this point in time. The vaccines have obviously failed. They're not safe. They're resulting in record numbers of deaths and injuries and disabilities. I just think the sooner we can see that. Do you know there's no vaccine parades, no gala events, no celebration at all on the success of the vaccines? If this is the signature program of our public health officials, you think they try to celebrate something? It's just a dark, immediate, short term and longer term for these vaccines. Nobody wants them.
No, exactly. But yet you still see crazy stuff like, the American Academy of Family Practice sends out these little missives every week or two. And I'm no longer a member. I gave that up in about 2008 or 2009 when I realized they were just a political arm for socialists. And I said, no, thanks. But, they send out this review of a study that says you're 11 times less likely to get myocarditis if you're vaccinated than unvaccinated. And I'm like, are you kidding? That just seems completely upside down to me. They only followed the patients for however long, 2 or 3 months after. So I'm like, well, you can't really say anything because the follow-up is so short. And then it gets published in circulation. And so people are thinking, well, yeah, we'll protect our kids by vaccinating them and then they won't get myocarditis. And I'm like, aren't we seeing the exact opposite
It's
of that?
true. This idea of, give somebody myocarditis to try to prevent myocarditis. This is heart damage. No heart. I'm a cardiologist. No amount of heart damage is acceptable. Daniels in 2020 reported on the Big Ten athletic program, where 30% of the athletes in the Big Ten in 2020, they got COVID-19. This is before the vaccines. And they looked for myocarditis. They searched for it. And out of thousands of athletes, there were 6 kids who had a troponin above the upper limit of normal. There was probably a couple dozen that had spurious findings on MRI. There were no clinical hospitalizations, no deaths, nothing. The NCAA gave up on it. And in the meantime, now we have papers pouring in. We've had 200 papers of serious myocarditis, fatal myocarditis, published by the Koreans, published in Connecticut from the Connecticut coroner, published from Washington University in St. Louis, fatal myocarditis. And so here people are fraudulently trying to say that they're going to get COVID and get myocarditis, which was actually looked for and wasn't present. But yet with the vaccines, it's coming in, fulminant myocarditis resulting in death. It's absolutely stunning. It's stunning. And the one paper you referred to, you have to point this out, is that when patients are hospitalized with COVID, they get routine troponin testing in the ICU like they do with pneumococcal and other forms of pneumonia. About 30% of people will be troponin positive. So they were using that to claim that these, legions of COVID inpatients were developing myocarditis. They never met a clinical definition based on EKG and echo and biomarkers and MRI. None of it. It was all by ICD codes. It was completely fraudulent.
Huh. So now I don't know how much are you working in clinical practice now, seeing outpatients, because you're so busy with everything else you're doing. But how, compared to your practice before COVID existed, like what is the increase in myocarditis that you're seeing in your outpatients?
I'm in a cardiology practice, a big one in Dallas, 2 days a week. The rest of the days, working as a clinical scholar. I'm a frequent contributor on Fox, but also I've been on ABC and Newsmax, a variety of programs, travel a lot. I can tell you my practice has really shifted. I've had so many new patients, many of whom who do not want to take the vaccines. So my practice shifted from mainly people who did take the vaccines to a big group that didn't. And I'm absolutely deluged with vaccine injuries, one after another. Blood clots that won't go away, pulmonary emboli, myocarditis. Prior to COVID, I think I saw 2 cases of myocarditis my entire career. Now I'm seeing dozens and dozens of cases. The late gadolinium enhancement by MRI is not going away after a year. It's not transient. It's not mild. This is a disaster. In my circles, I've been giving advice on a case in Florida, a young man who takes 3 of the shots. He's got fulminant myocarditis. He's in the ICU. He's on advanced support. The doctors will not recognize it's the vaccine. So there's no mention of the vaccine in the records, and it's so obvious that's what it is. Patients with paralysis, Guillain-Barré syndrome, a transverse myelitis. I had almost certainly a fatal case of vaccine-induced thrombocytopenia, thrombocytopenic purpura, and thrombosis. She died about 90 days after taking the vaccine. I'm reporting cases to the vaccine adverse event reporting system. It takes forever to do these reports. If the Zogby survey is right, then we got 15% of people who took the vaccines that are damaged in some way. And so, the healthcare system is going to be overrun.
Yeah. I think probably the last time we spoke that you were on our podcast, where we had been working in the urgent care center, it was we were amazed at same thing, the amount of vaccine injuries we were seeing coming in that correlated with having had the vaccine. And I actually did see he's a 24-year-old with myocarditis, POTS syndrome, actually a nurse who recognized that she was getting Guillain-Barré from the vaccine. She said, I'm positive it is. She was right. And numerous other things that we saw. And we looked at each other and said, can you remember back into all the years of giving, childhood vaccines in our practices? Tim especially had a really heavy pediatric OB practice. Like, can you remember how many vaccine injury or associated things? It was like maybe one. And then with this, it's just been crazy. And so the fact that people don't want to, I don't understand, recognize it. We talk to colleagues that just turn a blind eye, that say, no, well, it's a nice thought, but you can't prove it, so I'm not going to report it even, is really disturbing. And we've talked before about how underreported we think VAERS is because so many physicians don't want to even consider it. So VAERS, I think, is I wouldn't say a joke, but really unreliable to use anything that comes out when they say that there's really low data for certain things. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Well, I mean, theirs is crazy because it's so hard to fill
Yeah,
anything out with, penalty of being drawn and quartered.
The first couple times I started filling that out, even I thought, this is onerous. I'm busy. People don't want to stay after work and fill these things out and take all the time to do it. It's a lot of extra paperwork. And if they're already, I think, dismissive of the possibility of effects of the vaccine, it would be easy to just blow it off and say, I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, but it can still give you a signal because VAERS existed for everything else. And so if the signals change between flu shots and COVID shots and, hepatitis shots and all that, then at least it's a signal. But they don't even want to look at the signal when they said that they were going to do it. We interviewed Josh Getzkow, who got a FOIA request from the Children's Health Defense Group and went through all this. And they're like, the CDC said that they were going to do certain analysis to look at VAERS, to and they just didn't do it. They just lied.
It's true. There should have been monthly safety reports. America still has not had a safety report. The CDC and FDA have not told us how many people have died on, day 0 and day 1. We know that's where a lot of action is in the VAERS system. When you toggle over to U.S. data, there's now over 14,000 deaths. I want to say of those, there's about 1,000 that happen on day 0. I mean, it's just boom, they take the vaccine, they die in the vaccine center, or they die very shortly afterwards. I was with Ryan Cole. We were traveling across Florida. We stopped to get coffee, and some ladies saw us. They wanted pictures, and one gal said, I want to tell you the story of my dad. She took her dad out of independent living about a year ago, and she took him to a vaccine center to take the vaccine because she thought it was the right thing to do. He takes the vaccine and he dies in the passenger seat when she's driving him back to independent living. These stories, there's at least 1,000 of these stories. I mean, this is so clear. It's product related, and everybody knows it. Pfizer knew about 1,223 deaths in the court-ordered documents within 90 days release of their product, and they didn't pull it off the market. Should have been pulled after a handful of deaths. So to allow these deaths to occur, these immediate deaths to occur, CVS, Walgreens, who's ever administering them, they just cannot feel good about this as this continues.
What about what's your thoughts on, what was it? It was in Alberta, right? It was on the news where they had published 1 month earlier this year that the number one cause of death in the province was unknown cause of death. I don't know if you heard that. And there was a spoof that JP Sears did on that. And then it got on, was it Tucker? I can't remember.
It was on Mark Stein's
that's right,
British
Mark Stein.
TV show.
I'm a fan of Mark Stein. But anyway, so it was disturbing that the number one cause of death is unknown. And so we kind of looked into it a little bit. But you hear that and you hear about all these healthy, athletic people around the world, soccer players, football players, basketball players, usually males, just having sudden death. But we don't hear anything about autopsy reports or cause. It's just out there. I mean, are you hearing anything about them doing autopsies or finding the cause or any correlation to having had the vaccine? I mean, that's what everyone's
Well, we
surmising.
certainly encourage it. Paper by Gill and colleagues, Archives of Pathology, two kids in Connecticut. They die. They're teenagers. They die on day 3 and 4 after the second Pfizer shot. No opportunity for CPR. They're found dead by their parents. Parents get autopsies. Conclusion, fatal vaccine-induced myocarditis. We need more clear-cut cases like this, or we need the opposite. We need people to say it's not due to the vaccine. I'll give you an example. I just tweeted out a case of a boy where they extracted 6 feet of blood clots out of him. And there was this, consideration. Maybe it was due to the vaccine. And parents tweeted out, listen, he didn't have COVID and he didn't receive the vaccine. And you know what? We can just take that case out of consideration. Don't have to worry about it. But there are so many people dying, and there's never a mention on whether or not they took the vaccine. And there's no explanation of why they would die. I can tell you, I'm an epidemiologist. I study this. 40% of people die of heart disease, known heart disease, 40% known cancer, and 20% other causes. But it's known. I mean, it's a drug overdose, a car accident, cystic fibrosis, etc. We just have a tiny, tiny number of deaths each year where it's a complete mystery. Now, for large fractions, the whole province of Alberta to say that the biggest cause of death is unknown is staggering. The only smoking gun is the vaccine.
Yeah, it just, but again, like people's capacity to just sort of irrationally go with the flow still just blows my mind. I mean, I love the title of your book because, courage is what solves these problems. And we have been talking to all sorts of courageous people this year and trying to emphasize that on the podcast. But, like I go through social media and I see somebody that I used to work with who is outside and is a physician and is wearing an N95 mask and is probably on their 4th or 5th shot. And then you look at it and you go, why do you, like, you're not fit, you're obese, you've never taken care of yourself before, but now all of a sudden this is the Black Plague and magically the magic mask is going to save you so that you can, go walk around outside. Like, you just look at it, you just go, this is crazy. Or other people we know that are like the most religious vegans in the world, right? Everyone should live in an apartment building and conserve energy and drive an electric car and never shave their legs. And as soon as the vaccine comes out for kids, their kids are the first ones in line. And I'm like, you've hated every major corporation in the world up until this point.
I don't get it.
And now all of a sudden Pfizer is like, a hero. Like, it's become a cult. I mean, it's not even a religion.
Well, the most irrational vignette I can think of is, you have a really well-educated, careful, pregnant mother, won't have a drop of alcohol, won't even drink green tea, won't even eat soft cheese because motherhood and the baby really matter. Baby on board, right? There, with no consideration on what she's done, with no consideration on safety, with no assurances on short, middle, or long-term safety, with exclusion from randomized trials, where the FDA said don't do this in pregnancy, these women are taking COVID-19 genetic vaccines. That's the one that defies everything.
Yep.
It's like, listen, I never want to talk to another pregnant woman who says she cares about her body, or a careful vegan, or all these people virtue signaling all over who just pony up and take one of these genetic shots because they want to go to Atlantis or God knows why. I mean, really, it's stunning. It's a stunning lapse. One thing I've learned about this is there's a giant distinction between intelligence and having a strong mind. And most people actually have a very weak mind. I've seen this in family members, very smart family members. They would question every drug. They question every laboratory. They want my advice for hours, when people come over at Thanksgiving. But boy, when these shots came out with no critical thinking, no discussion, they took the shots. I was like, wait a minute. I thought you cared about all these drugs. You cared about all these labs. Suddenly you don't care about anything at all. You're just going to take the Chinese genetic code in your body. It's really amazing.
Well, we've been down that same path with friends and family, the exact same situation. And then they do ask us, and we will have these long discussions. And, like Tim, I've not researched as much as Tim. I think he's got a PhD in virology and immunology now from all the reading he's done and following everybody in the C19 groups that we're reading. But we'll explain what we know, but they somehow want to just trust the authorities. If the authorities say it's okay, we trust them blindly. And why wouldn't Fauci or these people, why would they lie? That blows my mind.
Yeah, but
I guess
they don't listen. The same people don't trust the statins and millions and millions of patients in clinical trials. They don't trust all this other stuff. Suddenly they trust the government on the vaccines, which I think is just stunning.
Right. Yeah, I'm still trying to piece that together, because you're right. It's some of these people are, they're physicians, they're good, caring, intelligent with everything. Not would say everything else, but you're right with the statins, other things. But when it comes to the COVID vaccine, what Fauci has been pushing, Trudeau, anyone, it's like, well, they've got our best interests at heart. What's our other option? And yeah, I don't even know what to say. It is almost like a cult.
I think resolving the cognitive dissonance is just too painful. Because the only, I'll quote studies, and I'll go through, this is how viruses work. This is why you can, eliminate smallpox and you can't eliminate colds, et cetera, and then the answer always comes back, well, then how come all the other authorities aren't saying this? And I'm like, well, because they're being censored. Haven't you seen who's been taken down? We've been taken down on Facebook we were on somebody else's program and I said the word ivermectin, and it just triggers an immediate ejection,
Yeah.
And you sit there and the only argument they have is, well, all the authorities should be saying this because, but then that means that you actually think that they have goodwill is their motivation. Their motivation is tell me a government agency where really the bottom line is goodwill. It's preservation of power. And it's always been like that. Just read history. People want to preserve their power when they get power, and they'll do whatever it takes to do that. I think that that's just so painfully obvious, but to admit that means, oh my gosh, I live in a scary world. Well, yeah, you live in a scary world. That's the way it is.
Yeah, but Tim, the same people don't trust the IRS. They don't. The same people don't trust the voting system. Suddenly, they blindly trust the CDC, NIH, and FDA and the vaccines all the way. None of this makes sense. I think most of it is driven through fear, and fear makes the human mind just lose its processing. But the fear is only around SARS-CoV-2 or COVID. People are thinking okay in other areas, but the fear here is just, it's overwhelming, and they don't want to, they've taken the stuff in their body. They know they can't get it out, and they don't want to hear a word about it. Most people, it's a proxy for people in the mass formation where they're in the form of this trance or hypnosis, is they'll say, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. Because they've actually taken the vaccines in their body. Now, you two took the vaccines, but you now recognize it as a mistake, and you have the mental strength to be able to discuss it. Most people don't have that. They simply can't come forward and say that. But with that, the New York Times had a piece in May of 2022 on the front cover that said 35% of Americans are not taking a vaccine, or they're not taking a booster. 35%. The CDC says 18% of people haven't taken a vaccine at all. That's me. I haven't taken it. I'm not going to. So that means 17% of people are not taking it anymore. That's probably you're in that group. So now we've got a third of the nation, and that was back in May. It's now September. I bet we're now up to 45% of the country is not going to take a shot. And with 45% of the country dug in on this, they've already lost their jobs. They've already been screwed over. Look at Aaron Rodgers. He's already been through hell with the Packers. He's not taking a shot. Look at everything he went through, right? He was on Joe Rogan and told about the vaccine discrimination. There are so many people like us, honestly, that have actually already been through the illness. They're not taking any more shots.
No, I agree. read and follow some of the more liberal news channels, just with the comments online. And that seems to be the consensus too amongst people posting on there, like, we trusted and we believed. We did the first two, but we've had COVID. Yeah, we're kind of done. And the consensus, like, just reading 80% of people on there, just like, forget it, we're not doing any more. And I think you're right that the numbers are climbing. No matter what side of the aisle you're on, people are deciding they're done. No more vaccines, boosters.
But May, it's a fun exercise. I did it this morning. It's a good way to clean up your Twitter feed. Is do a search for people using the hashtags get boosted or get vaccinated. It's really fun. I can tell you today I did get boosted, and out of 2 billion people on Twitter, do you know how many people were using that hashtag? About 20 or 30. That's it. I'm telling you, there's no enthusiasm for these. There's a bunch of little fake accounts that say, hey, really good idea to get a shot. No one's interested in these. There are massive protests. In Europe, they're putting up these easels across the bridges in the cities of all the loved ones who've died of the vaccine. It's like a war. And they're just saying, listen, you can't censor this. Wow. They're just going to show all the people in these European cities who've died with the vaccine. So the resistance is extraordinary. The anger and outrage cannot be underestimated. I think the $1 million question is, will any of these candidates coming up for election actually break out of the formation? The first one that really says, listen, I'm gonna go ahead and pull these things off the market, the entire country would gush behind them, would absolutely gush. Nobody wants them. They're completely unwanted. And listen, even if they left them on the market and some people wanted to take a few more shots at their own risk, so be it. But no one wants their job, their education, their military career tied to one of these genetic injections where they could lose their life. Certainly not me. There's no job that's worth it to me. I'm not going to take it.
No. And Tim and I were just talking, the other day, we're wondering what's going to be happening in the future with vaccine injury, lawsuits, legal claims. What that one on TV that we're seeing now all the time is Camp Lejeune from the 50s to the 80s with the toxic water. So there's all these legal cases of people who had ingested this water back from 50 to 80. And I'm like, I want, I think I hope to be alive in 30 years from now to be a fly on the wall to see what starts to happen as time goes on and more information comes out. But you're right. I think it just depends on who's in power and, what lawyers are going to tackle this. And
they'll be too big to fail. This will be another massive bailout if the lawsuits really start to blow things up. I mean, that would be great. I'd love it. But I'd like to see investigations where the people that really perpetrated this are held accountable. I'm not holding my breath that will happen, but I think, you can always hold out hope. Clearly I think Fauci and Redfield and Birx, and they all left because they saw that the ship was heading for an iceberg, and they wanted to get off while there was still a lifeboat, or a perceived one.
Well, here's the thing. End of August, we have fewer than 500,000 Americans taking one of these vaccines. We have 330 million Americans in the United States. Are we going to ramp up to basically tens of millions, if not 100 million or more, taking these boosters? The U.S. government has bought 170 million plus doses. The question is, are these things going to sit on the shelves, or are they going to really, really start to apply the heat to force people to take these boosters? That, to me, we're going to find out in the next few weeks. It's going to be really, really something to watch.
Yeah, but if you have 45% of the population that is like saying no, and you see kind of both sides of the aisle saying the same thing, like, that is political suicide. That's almost as bad as doing a speech where you have a red background and you look like Hitler. It's almost that bad. Or where you raid a political opponent with the FBI.
Yeah.
Almost that bad.
I think any candidate could
it's
go out right now
unbelievable.
and run on being against the vaccines and win in a landslide. I really do. Listen, you guys, I'm going to have to get going. We're going to have to leave it here. But thank you so much for having me on the program.
Hey, well, thanks so much for coming back. Before we quickly end, just give a shout out to your book again and where people can find it, as well as your podcast that you now have up and going since last time.
So you can go to my link tree, petermcculloughmd.com, get to all my social media. Out of all the early treatment doctors and people who testified in the Senate, I've got the most followers.
Yes, you do.
And all the people went on Joe Rogan. I'm number one ahead of Elon Musk and everybody else. But also, the book is on couragetofacecovid.com. It's on Amazon. It's a bestseller. It's 300 pages. You read it in 2.5 hours. It's a fun read. Everybody needs to have it. Steve Bannon, who I went on with recently on his show, really impressed me. He looks like hell, but man, he just really gets it. Steve Bannon said he's so glad that we wrote the books. There's very few COVID books. He goes, but the books with the citations are going to be the evidence that's going to be used for investigations. Bannon is predicting all the electronic media is going to be washed clean. Twitter, Facebook, Google, all the search engines, they're going to be whitewashed. And then only the books are going to remain, the independent media like your podcast and the documentaries. There's the only things that are going to remain, because everything else is going to be whitewashed. They're going to try to cover up as much as they possibly can. This is going down as the biggest debacle of all time in human history. So anyhow, and lastly,
right? No kidding. So I'll put all the links in. Absolutely. We know you got to run, but I just want to say thank you so much for coming back on our show again. And it's great to always keep in contact with you. And you are a true patriot. We just love what you're doing and how you've been fighting the fight and being the big voice for all of us smaller voices out here.
Exactly.
So you're welcome to come back.
You guys are doing
anytime.
a great job. Remember my podcast, America Out Loud Talk Radio, McCullough Report, every Saturday, every Sunday, twice, and then podcast network starting on Tuesday.
Ciao. Bye-bye, Peter.
Okay, that was an amazing interview as always. If you've ever listened to Peter interviewed by anybody else, I just listened to an interview he did recently with Sebastian Gorka, and he is just amazing. So to summarize, 3 things struck me in the interview. Number one, if you look at studies with regards to where they compare the vaccinated to the unvaccinated in the United States, there's no vaccine tracking. So there's essentially no way to know who's vaccinated and who's unvaccinated in a real study format where you have it completely defined, because they just go off the medical record. And the medical record with regards to vaccination is not great. Okay, and that's why when we look at vaccine information and trends as far as COVID, it's really important to go look at countries that actually track this, like the UK, Israel, etc., and Canada even. And British Columbia started to see a massive spike in the number of vaccinated people admitted to the hospital. So then they just stopped showing the data. They just stopped producing it. It's like, there's nothing to see here, carry on. So I think that that's a really interesting point. Number 2, Fauci did not mention his work with COVID and the COVID task force in his, resignation letter, which is kind of like you're an expert downhill skier and you have been on the national team for decades and you won a whole bunch of World Cup medals, and you just don't mention that you won an Olympic gold medal, the greatest thing that you can win in skiing. It's like, yeah, never mind that. That one just completely blows my mind. I do not, it's like, forget what I did in the last 3 years and all the stuff I've said. We're just going to move on from here. But I think the most telling thing that has stuck with me from this interview is when Peter said there's a difference between intelligence and a strong mind. And there's lots of really intelligent people that don't necessarily have a strong mind. The cognitive dissonance of seeing something in reality every day and listening to what authorities say and how that, contradicts each other, they just can't deal with. And we have seen this over and over and over and over again in our own lives, and it never ceases to blow us away. I don't understand that. And I think that's the challenge to all of us here and listening is, what are you going to do to make sure that you have a strong mind? What's the mind gym, so to speak? And I think it's being willing to speak up sometimes when it's hard, but being gracious about it. I think it's reading and making your own decisions. And I've honestly become convinced that the hardest thing to do in today's society is really just think for yourself. I mean, we're so used to other stuff being done for us. It's like, no, you should formulate your own opinions based on information that you gathered yourself. And people should challenge you, and you should challenge others. That's how you become wise. And we just utterly forgotten that. It's easier to just not deal with the mental distress of going, holy crap, something here doesn't smell right.
All right. So great to have Peter on the show again. I mean, I think that was so awesome to have him back and give his time. And I want you guys to check out the links that I put in the show notes for you, which includes his book. And you should also check out his podcast if you haven't already, and take a listen to it. Great stuff on there with updates on all the medical information on COVID vaccines that he's talked about. And you can find him on some social media channels as well if you hunt hard. I did find him on Instagram. Someone was trying to hack his page. And so he's out there. So I'll put all those links in for you. And go support Dr. McCullough because he needs our support because he's been going through a lot of litigation. So shout out to Peter. And thanks again to our sponsor this week, which is New Leaf Hyperbarics and Wellness in Eugene, Oregon. We love our hyperbaric chamber. Oh, actually, it's their chamber, but we love going and getting treatments, and we know you will too.
Outstanding. So remember, the bottom line here is the difference between Fauci and Peter McCullough is Fauci says, I am the science. McCullough says, here is the science. Make up your own mind. And I think that's the challenge for all of us. We will see you next week.
Have you heard of hyperbaric therapy?
If you want better circulation, oxygenation, or respiration,
Turn up the volume.
Everyone appreciates the increased energy and clarity.
Athletes, say goodbye to those PRs because you're going to blast
So
them.
how does it work?
We load your body with oxygen.
That means
less inflammation,
fewer allergies,
faster healing, and more.
Come see us, 1200 Executive Parkway.
You know, the Upside Down building.
Call us, 541-636-3278.
That's 541-636-3278.
We have some incredible deals.
Heal, build, and thrive
With New Leaf Hyperbarics.
Got air?
It's no secret that medicine is a bit, uptight. That's why Tim and I created BS Free MD, to mix things up a little and have fun in the process. Besides, we are having these exact same discussions all the time, so we thought we might as well invite everyone to the party. If you really like us, you can get plenty more, and maybe see one of Tim's cool tattoos on our Instagram or Facebook pages at BS Free MD. See you next time.
While we try to keep BS Free MD as raw and real as possible, we can't be held responsible for any medical decisions or discussions had as a result of what you've heard on the show. We know, bummer. But the truth is, we really do care about your questions. So feel free to reach out to us by email at doc@bsfreemd.com.